Okay, here I am again, talking about PHP. So last time I went over structures of projects and some of the basics of how you get this stuff working in terms of at least working from another perspective. Um, Now I'm going to go over the some of how the code works. But before I get into that, a thing that I omitted last time, and maybe I remembered to put it in the description, but probably I didn't. Um, is that when you've got your when you've got your composer.json and you've built up a basic composer.json, um, which you might have done using composer in it, of course. You type composer install. That is the thing which initially creates composer.lock and creates the vendor directory. Um, After you've done composer install, um, mostly you wouldn't need to run that again, at least not for a particular project. But if you were thinking that you want to, if you're thinking that you want to update composer.lock from composer.json, because that is how it thinks of it, you type composer update. That would happen if your composer.json has changed, but also trivially, if you just want to make sure that your code still works with the latest versions of whatever upstream modules are, at least as far as your specifications are concerned, composer update should update all of those requirements, and you should be able to see if that's the case. In general, composer update for that purpose is better to avoid, because if you keep doing it, you won't notice if you're using if you're requiring a particular version that's newer than the version that you actually asked for. Just briefly on these version numbers, you can see they've got little carets at the beginning of them. That has a specific meaning to Composer. I don't remember what it is. Go look it up. This, I think, was probably automatically generated. But yeah, so there are different ways that these things can be expressed. I think there's an equal sign to say you want exactly a particular version if you're being really strict. And I think I think if you have a caret, that means that it needs to match the major and minor versions. And if you have a greater than sign, then that means that you will just take any version that's later than that. Usually, I think caret is the one that you want to go for, because that final version number bit is one that won't be meaningful. And so, okay, well, I guess I'll briefly go over versioning. So when you're doing a version, you normally will want to have this kind of structure, which is major.minor.patch level. And what that means is that if the patch level changes, then more or less you've just said this is just an improvement. This is solely an improvement. It's not gonna break anything. If the minor number changes, then you might be expressing that that there's something different in the way that things might be returned, or something different in the way that they might be accepted. But for the overwhelming majority of cases, that everything will be completely compatible. In general, that might be you might do that for if you've added a bunch of new methods which weren't previously present, or if you've started returning something which is slightly different from what you were originally returning, but is still, you believe, compatible with everybody's actual usage. And the major version that you would change if you think you've done something to break it. If you think you've, so for example, if you've deleted some methods, you probably would change a major version, or if you've significantly changed how they work. But it's not set in stone. That's the interesting thing about this. A lot of people do things, have different expressions of what major and minor really mean. And so you don't have to think of it as a big fixed thing, but certainly the major version should change if big stuff is different, and the minor number should change at the very least if something is done which might break something somewhere. That's more or less all you need to worry about with that. Anyway, I'm going to get onto some code because I was going to talk about code. So this is a PHP class. This is a fairly standard expression of it, although I've been very lazy and I haven't put any documentation on the class itself. I should have done that probably. It's a complicated topic in terms of how you document things. I mean, really, so when you're writing personal code, it's completely up to you. Of course it is. But if somebody else is dealing with your code, then you might want to write a little English sentence that explains what's going on here, what this object is, so that people don't have to actually look at the code directly, at the very least, so that they can just find all of what it does in one little block at the top, rather than having to scroll all the way down. So yes, so this method has documentation, however. So you can see this is a / and 2 stars. That's how you say this is formatted documentation. If it has 1 star, it's not formatted. It's just block documentation. That was terrible autocomplete. Please don't do that. So we've got some brief text that tells you what it does. And then you've got the structured part of the documentation. So here it's at param. So there should be an at param. Oh, wow, that's a lot of text. Oh, there you go. Yeah, there's so an at param, there should be 1 for each argument in order. I've actually made a mess of this one because this should be like that, I think. Yeah, so there should be an at param for each of the arguments in order. And that should be at param space type space variable name. There are other ways of doing that, and I'll cover that just in a minute. And you will usually want to have an at return, which defines the type of the return value. Now, there's some complexity to this because, firstly, this format is actually documented. It's documented in PSR5. So I described what PSRs are in the last video. But PSR5 has been abandoned. Nobody uses it. So in practice, there isn't a documented standard. And you might notice also that PSR5 doesn't actually cover everything that you want to do. It covers really very little. It's something which was clearly something that people valued a few years ago, and then they kind of forgot about it. It was kind of doing okay. If you want to see a non-PSR5 compliant but still similar documentation system that actually is still maintained in some sense, that's php.doc. So if you search for php.doc, you can find that. Or PHP Documenter? Actually, I think it's PHP Documenter. So search for PHP Documenter, you can find that, and that's got slightly more to it. It's more full, but obviously the problem with that is that some of those things won't end up standardized in the distant future when PSRs finally get sorted out. Anyway, so there are problems with that. This comma ... syntax is actually from PSR5, and it's a thing that I think is probably not in PHP Documenter. This is actually just expressing that I'm using splat syntax, or spread syntax. Spread syntax? I don't know. Well, varogs, I guess. I'll call it varogs because that's essentially what it is. Um, but I'll cover that in a minute. Um, that's what this business is here. Um, and you might notice that my at return line here says something a little bit different to what my actual return declaration is. Even if you don't quite know what a return declaration is, you can see that one says iterable string, the other one says iterable. This is actually um, this is a fairly good example of where documentation is helpful and where it's not helpful, because so here I'm actually expressing to the reader and perhaps to a document generator program, who knows, that this is an iterable thing, but specifically it's an iterable thing which is only going to return strings. And that's not a thing that you can actually express in PHP syntax at the moment. Probably will be in future, but who knows? It's very difficult to tell these things. So here I'm providing information that, at the very least, to the reader can communicate what it is that they can expect to get out, and that's the thing that's helpful to the reader. You can also just have text after there. These are strings. There you go, and that would also be visible to the reader. In fact, if I mouse over this, does this? No, it doesn't. Oh, if only. VS Code, why do you not have good built-in PHP support? Just the syntax highlighting. So people who have access to the documentation in various ways will be able to see this text here, and that may communicate something to them that the strict format of the thing will not communicate. And in particular, a way in which PHP is kind of complicated is that it sits there ready for you to pass arrays around all the time, and arrays obviously have a single type. They're just array. That's all it is. In fact, it doesn't even matter if it's an indexed array, a classic array, a real array, or if it's an associative array, which is you might think of as like a key value map or a dictionary. It's all array to PHP. So with arrays in particular, you need to go to a lot of extra effort to communicate what exactly it is that you are talking about, because you will have specific expectations of what's been received and what's been returned. And that's just something which is difficult in conventional PHP, because in conventional PHP you often do a lot of passing those arrays around instead of passing objects around. Okay, so going back up to the top, PHP historically was a templating language. This is just like crazy prehistory stuff. So like in the 20th century, not in this century, just really in the 20th century, you would be expected to write an HTML page and just nip into PHP and nip out again at kind of random intervals where you feel like doing it. So because of that, as a consequence of that, you actually need to have an XHTML compliant programming instruction to start a PHP file. And it's so silly, but it's just a thing. It's a thing that is still done in PHP for historical reasons. So you simply have to do $PHP, and then some space or an enter key. So normally you press enter afterwards. If you don't do that, it will look to the PHP parser like it's just printing a huge string. That's it. And that won't run. That won't work at all. So you need to have that. Strictly speaking, for a processing instruction, it also needs to end with $greater than. Look at that. You can see that VS Code has understood here that I've now just turned all of this into HTML, which is useless. Yes, so strictly speaking, you do need that $greater than. You occasionally will see that in some older code, but the PHP parser, I think since probably PHP 5.6, has not required that be used to end a file. So it's perfectly okay to not include it in the end, and in fact, it's generally preferable not to include it. So yeah, just don't bother. It's fine. So you should have one class per, or rather one top-level symbol per file, and it should be named after what the file is. This is just convention, but it makes life so much easier, and obviously it's required for auto-loading. So yeah, just do that. That's how you do this. So so this is declaring a class called fake network handler, and it's saying that curl PSR handler is the superclass. So I'm not going to go too much into what classes are, but if you're not familiar, so it's saying what a class of objects is. So you can think of a class as like taxonomy in terms of how a species is described. So you can say that there's a species of this thing, and this is how you describe this species. So in some other context, you would say that you want to have an object of this class, and then when you have an object of this class, this describes how it behaves. So the extends keyword here says that that there are some things which aren't described in here in this file itself. Where they aren't present in this file, you should look for them in this other file. And it also has a slight semantic variation on that, which is that you still retain the ability to refer to the superclass version of it, of any particular method. So in this case, the superclass is curl PSR/handler, and that will have a bunch of methods that are not defined here, and it might well have one that's exactly this method that I have defined, but if it does, it's not getting called anymore. In fact, I know that it does have that method because of course it does. That's the whole point of this class. Okay, so this is a method. So these are things that exist on functions. Oh, sorry, not functions. These exist on objects, and you can think of them as being verbs. In particular, you should be making sure that if there is a method which does something, it's got a verb phrase as its name, and if there's a method that doesn't do something, you might, but only might, you might have a name which is noun based. And these names should be indicating what the method will do, not how you want to do it. And where it's a, where it's a, where it has a particular meaning to the object, that meaning to the object should be expressed in the name, rather than the meaning from outside. So, for example, if there's a house object, you probably wouldn't want to have a method on the house object called open door, because it's the object doing the action, which is opening the door. It's not the house that's doing that. Even if the code for it is in the house, that's not normally that's not how it is viewed from the house's perspective. So from the house's perspective, that might be you might have something like set door open to true, and that might be a thing that makes more sense from that perspective. So this is a protected function. So what that means, which is very relevant to this case, is that other objects may not call this. So this is a method which is invisible outside of this class, but objects which are derived from this one can call it, and it is visible to them, and very specifically those objects can override this method. So the extremes of method visibility on a class are private and public. So private means literally nothing outside this exact class has visibility of what the method is or what the property is. And public means everything does. So protected is there in the middle to cover situations where you really are expecting that subclasses will either call it or will override it. Strictly speaking, if you have a private function that exists in the superclass, I think you may be able to have the same name of private function in a subclass, but it will never be called from the superclass code. So that's the way it works. Whereas if it were protected, it would be. So here, because I have to, because I am deliberately overriding something, this method needs to be protected, and there's no way it can possibly work otherwise. And specifically, it needs to be protected in the superclass, and the subclass, the child class one, this one, needs to have the same definition. And that's to make sure it's clear that it's referring to exactly the same symbol. You can't be lazy with this stuff. You do have to actually write it out in the same way. So yes, so this is a method. It's essentially a verb or a verb phrase for the object. And it takes in its brackets here an array of arguments or parameters, should you so desire. And so those would be called from the other side without the type on there, but probably with variable names or with expressions, which I'm not going to cover right now because that's really kind of deep in the concept of what programming is. Anyway, so in this particular case, you express what the type is. The type is not strictly required in PHP, but you should include it. If you include it, then you can see what's going on inside the code. If you don't include it, you can only guess. I mean, you can say in your head, oh, yes, I know that anybody who's calling my code in the approved way is using this type of object. But if you're looking at the code, you can't know that. And in particular, you can document a type and then not put it in here. That is a possible thing to do. But you shouldn't do that because putting it in here means that PHP will make sure your code never runs with a different type, or with a type that's not compliant with this one. So always put that type in. If you've got any version of PHP, I think later than 5, you can do that. And yeah, there's no reason not to. There may be certain cases, so there may be cases where you just got some random thing where you don't have enough type information in essence to do anything. In that case, yes, omit the type because you can't have mixed in there at the moment. Possibly that may be a thing that was fixed in PHP 7.4. I don't know, but yes, that's how it works. So the type is an interface or a class. So essentially what that's saying is that every argument, or rather the argument in this case, has to be one for which argument name instance of this bit of left is true. Strictly speaking, that's not exactly correct because I believe that primitive types like string and int don't actually have instance of functionality. But if there's a class name here, that's the case. And the other primitive types are similar cases that you can understand as being the case. So when it's called, PHP will just refuse. It will stop dead if the call has provided something else. And that's generally the situation that you want to happen. You want to make sure that everything stops before you get into crazy world where you can't understand what's going on anymore. The whole thing of exceptions is kind of complicated topic, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Maybe I'll go into that in future. Um, we'll see. In fact, I'm going to write that down because that's a good topic to talk about, and hopefully I'll remember for my tiny scribble. So yeah, we've got those little dots, that little ellipsis, exactly 3 dots here. So that's saying that you can call it with any number of arguments, 0 or more, in fact, which is in itself kind of a problem with the way that the syntax works, but whatever. You can call it with 0 or more arguments, and those arguments will appear as an array inside here. So rather than passing an array in, for example, you can actually just put another comma and then another name after that. So you can see, yes, here's an example of an actual function call. That's how they're called normally. So this function here, substra, would have that would have a definition which has got probably open bracket string space $b, comma probably int space $start, comma int space $finish as its arguments. So this substra command could work with this kind of syntax. It would have to do it without a type in this case, and if it did, then that could have been ... $arguments. Please don't do that, but that is a thing that you can do. And the first member of that array would be $b, and the second one would be 0, and the third one would be 2. And yes, at the end of this, we've got a return type. You should always include a return type unless it's really not defined. So there are cases where you have what's called a void return, which is to say you have no return statement in there, and it's expected that nobody would do anything with your method apart from call it. They wouldn't expect anything out of it. So if you do that, that's a void method. You can mark those up as void. You can put void in here, and you can put void in documentation as well. But a lot of the time when you're writing those methods, you don't mean this is not going to return anything. You just mean, I don't know, I haven't decided yet. You just mean that there isn't anything that you anticipate returning there. So if you're not anticipating returning anything in particular, but you don't really know that you're not going to return anything, I would normally suggest not putting a return type on there, not putting an @return on there either. And that way callers will know, that way callers will understand that if they are for some reason using the return type on this, which would appear as null when they try and do it, if they are using that value may change in future. But in general, there's not a particular reason not to put a void return value on there. Okay, I've talked for too long again because I just like to do that apparently. So next time I'm going to get on to talking more about, probably talking more about return types and documentation, because that's an interesting thing. We'll see what else, but I'll go down the rest of the code because that's what I'm doing here. So thank you for watching.